Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. We're going to start the event now. I'd like to welcome you to AEI on this beautiful afternoon for an event that's co-sponsored with the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And I'm thankful that they're here and that they've brought Clint Watts down and Mary Haybeck, who's recently joined us here at AEI as a visiting scholar. I am Catherine Zimmerman. I'm a senior analyst on the Critical Threats Project, and I've been working on Al-Qaeda for the past 5 years. I am hoping that this will be a very interesting discussion as Mary Haybeck and Clint Watts, both of whose work I admire very, very much, will give us their views on the Al-Qaeda challenge. Mary just joined us here at AEI after being a professor at SAIS, and she's publishing a sequel to her book, Knowing the Enemy, next year, which is going to focus on Al-Qaeda's grand strategy. And she just published a report with AEI called Getting It Right, and that's available outside, and it's also available at criticalthreats.org. Clint Watts is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and he's published extensively on transnational threats for the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point and the CIA's Studies on Intelligence, among others. His work is available through the FPRI website, which is at fpri.org, and also at the Selected Wisdom blog, which he's an editor of, at selectedwisdom.com. I will be moderating their discussion, and I've asked them to keep their answers short. I'm really looking forward to what will prove to be a very lively discussion on Al-Qaeda, and we'll open up to questions from the audience toward the end. So starting with Clint, just ask you a basic question of what is Al-Qaeda?
All right. So thanks for having me here to AEI and FPRI. FPRI has given me, a lot of room to run and write a lot of crazy stuff, over the years, and let me publish. I really appreciate that. So I'm going to start off with some of my favorite jihadis online. Jan Berger and we love this one because how can you know if you're winning if you have no idea or a common agreement of what Al-Qaeda is? This is very, very difficult position that we're in. And it's not just us who's trying to figure out who's in Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is trying to figure out who's in Al-Qaeda today. What you see right there is a person on the coast of Kenya says, "Brother, are Al-Shabaab against ISIS?" They said, "I'm not authorized to speak about that because they'll probably cut off my phone and maybe behead me if I speak out of turn. But we, pledge loyalty to Zawahiri and Al-Qaeda Central." And then the ironic thing about it, well, it doesn't mean you have to, if you give someone the oath of loyalty that you actually have to keep following them if they're wrong. You gotta love young people on social media, right? We just pick the course of action we want and we run with it. And what do you see when you look at that logo? Whose face is on it? Is that bin Laden or is that Zawahiri? It's bin Laden, right? And so this is sort of the tumult that's going on in Al-Qaeda right now. The funniest thing about our discussion today is Al-Qaeda might very well be the second most important jihadist group in the world as of today. The Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham may very well be the most important thing going on in the jihadi landscape. In the past 3 weeks, ISIS cells have been disrupted in Saudi Arabia. You had the Jewish museum shooter who is being linked to what's going on as maybe participating with ISIS. Doesn't look like he was commanded by him. I mean, he had a GoPro and a gun, hung out with some buddies. And then just 2 days ago, you had reports from Germany that they had disrupted an ISIS cell. None of this was commanded or led by Al-Qaeda Central. And so when we're talking about is Al-Qaeda winning, I'll put it in another circumstance. Let's say we wanted to know about the state of Major League Baseball. Say, what's the state of Major League Baseball? And I, being a St. Louis Cardinals fan, would say, how are the Cardinals doing? But the Cardinals, while the center of the baseball universe and probably 99% of what's going on, are one of only 26 teams. And that's only 26 if you count the Astros and the Blue Jays, which we could probably get rid of. So what I'm talking about is Al-Qaeda, and I wrote this for FPRI, the 1.0, 2.0 sort of thing was the dominant force in jihad. They were the ones leading. They called themselves the vanguard, and they led sort of the jihadi movement. Today, they're one of many. And there's still the one that I call old guard Al-Qaeda. You'll hear me refer to that today. That I have no doubt right now somewhere they are planning attacks against the United States. No doubt that that's going on. I have no doubt that they're trying to communicate with affiliates and al-Qaeda operatives all over the world, and I'm sure they are. But the way that's received today versus the way that was received when bin Laden was in charge is wildly different. And so when we talk about al-Qaeda, the way I define al-Qaeda, I will call them old guard al-Qaeda. Those that are still committed to the original objectives of al-Qaeda, that are still focused on far enemy attacks against the U.S. And when I'm talking about that, I try and be as specific as possible, because you'll see when I get to the fifth part, this is really where I talk about how we have to focus our CT strategy. Zawahiri and a couple dozen old guard committed operatives, Pakistan, Afghanistan, al-Qaeda Central is how they're commonly referred to. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the most important al-Qaeda element in the world at this point. They've got a demonstrated and repeated capability. They've tried on 3 occasions to do an external operations attack into the U.S. I have no doubts, are planning an attack against us right now. No doubt whatsoever. They are the decisive point in the future for old guard al-Qaeda, in my opinion. We'll kind of come to that with some scenarios in a few minutes. Certain key leaders in AQIM in the Sahel that are running the actual AQIM cells that are out there, and if you ever want to kind of know how they're trying to communicate, the Associated Press has those great documents they recovered in Timbuktu that are out there. I'm worried about those folks. And Belmokhtar, who's sort of the off-the-reservation al-Murabatin, I'm running my own al-Qaeda group, and wants to be in direct contact with Zawahiri. That was one of the arguments that was in the documents. Select members of al-Shabaab under Godani, who pledged loyalty in 2012 and are still running external operations, as you've seen with the Westgate attacks in Kenya. Still concerned about them. And most important now and into the horizon is Jabhat al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda's primary arm and the future for them to move into this next generation of jihad. They are the new face or the future generation of what will come out for old guard al-Qaeda if they can keep moving on. They're in some steep competition. The other 2 things that I'll worry about are old guard al-Qaeda operatives that you see floating around. So you see them floating around in Syria. They'll be with Nusra. They'll try and coordinate with the Islamic Front, do a little trade and barter. Hey, would you guys work on operations with us against ISIS, which I'll come to later, or some other group, or Americans that are floating and joining up with Nusra. So we saw the suicide bomber from Florida last week, that was a suicide bomber from Nusra. That I'm really worried about. So when I talk about al-Qaeda, that's the strain that I'm most concerned with still to this day, and that to me is what al-Qaeda is.
Great. And Marion, the same question for you, since you just published a report looking at what is al-Qaeda and actually walked through the current administration's definition of al-Qaeda. I think that it might be useful for the viewers to actually hear what the administration has defined as al-Qaeda and then how you see it.
The administration's view of al-Qaeda is actually quite constrained and narrow and defined to a large extent by the authorization for the use of military force that was passed in September of 2001, and might explain why the Senate is in the midst of updating that. According to that, al-Qaeda is solely those people who carried out 9/11. That is, it's a very tiny little group of people, sometimes called the core or core leadership, have their houses or residence somewhere in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and from there are plotting and planning to carry out attacks against the United States and others. That's the definition that's used by this administration. And when they talk about affiliates, they mean very loosely aligned groups that share some of the goals of al-Qaeda, but not all of them. Sometimes listen to what the al-Qaeda core says, sometimes don't, and have their own agendas, usually sort of local agendas. They want to overthrow the local guy, replace him with their type of leadership, impose their vision of a very extremist Sharia on unwilling Muslims. So that's the definition that's used by this administration. My definition of al-Qaeda is actually based primarily on their self-definition. That is the way al-Qaeda itself defines itself, corrected and also adjusted, and with a little bit of skepticism, by looking at what's going on in the real world. So how does al-Qaeda define itself? It defines itself as an organization and an ideology. An organization that is a hierarchical organization with a leadership and then guys under them who are supposedly doing what the leadership wants them to do. And also hierarchical in the sense that you have what's known as the High Command off there in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then you have what they call branches that are linked organically. The term they use in Arabic is udwiya, linked organically to this High Command. And so the argument that they have is this organization gives orders, and people down on the ground at least attempt to obey them. But there's other things about the organization. It's also defined by this bayat that Clint mentioned. Bayat is an oath of fealty, very much like a feudal oath of fealty, that you're supposed to obey. Just as, let's say the King of France back in 1200 had a whole lot of dukes and barons and others that had sworn an oath of fealty, and they're supposed to obey their king based on that oath. And then along with that, there's all these personal connections. People have known each other for decades, fought together in Afghanistan, trained in Afghanistan, and these personal connections also go into forming this organization. But along with that, there's also this ideology that links them all together. And it's an ideology that has three pieces, at least according to Al-Qaeda. It has an ideology, Al-Qaeda, it has a methodology, Minhaj, and it has a very, very extremist and specific version of Sharia that no one else in the world actually adheres to. So those three things are what Al-Qaeda uses in order to define itself and who belongs to us. Now, here's the thing about that. Sometimes we get lucky and you have people, leak things or say things like this on social media when they're not supposed to. And they say things like, yes, we're part of Al-Qaeda. Or you have some sort of dispute or discussion going on amongst people, and somebody says, you're not really Al-Qaeda, and somebody says, yes, we really are. We swore bayat. And so you get this kind of glimpse into some of these groups that have indeed sworn this oath of fealty and do consider themselves to be Al-Qaeda. But often, people are sort of hiding it. So, for instance, Clint mentioned some of the documents that were found after northern Mali was liberated from these extremists. And one of the things that was found was a document describing the relationship between Ansar ad-Din, a local group that was somehow attached to Al-Qaeda, and describing its relationship with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And what that said was they actually were Al-Qaeda the whole time, and were told, don't say anything about your connections to anything having to do with Al-Qaeda or a global agenda or even something jihadist. You are a Dawa group who's just here to fix things in northern Mali. That's your messaging. That's the framing we want for you. We do not want you to be talking about your connections with Al-Qaeda. So sometimes you don't get any glimpses into the real relationships that are going on with people unless people leak things in social media or put something out in an email or something that happens to get leaked and we all get a chance to take a look at it. And so you fall back, as I have, on those last three, that is the ideology. Do they share Al-Qaeda's methodology, ideology, or creed, and their version of Sharia? Now, the interesting thing about ISIS, that is the Islamic State of Iraq and the Sham, which is this sort of breakaway group in Syria that has declared its independence from Al-Qaeda, once had a relationship with them and now has declared their independence from them, is the argument they're having with Al-Qaeda was specifically about Minhaj. That is specifically about the methodology that was being used by Al-Qaeda. They disagreed profoundly with it, and for that reason, they broke away from Al-Qaeda. So it was significant enough for ISIS to make this the center of their dispute with Al-Qaeda and to define themselves as different from Al-Qaeda, that is, their ideology and their Minhaj methodology in particular.
Great. Well, Clint, there's a lot to respond to there.
Yeah.
I think from what I've read of your work, you've written extensively about the ideology of Al-Qaeda and actually the threat that poses to us. And my sense is that you have a slightly different take than Mary on what that is.
So I think the ideology stuff is nonsense. I'll just put that out right away. Here's why. Ideology is malleable. And these guys, whenever they want to change it, will. And that's what's going on with the Bayat and Oath of Loyalty right now. If you follow with ISIS, there's a lot of debate between Al-Qaeda and ISIS about did Baghdadi swear an oath of loyalty to bin Laden? And Al-Qaeda says, oh, yes, he did. And Baghdadi says, no, I kind of did, but then, things changed, right? I'm waiting for the ideology that tells me the justifications right now for why ISIS can suicide bomb Jabhat al-Nusra and Old Guard al-Qaeda operatives. I'm trying to figure out the ideology right now that says that Nusra can do suicide bombings against ISIS members. That ideology will morph to whatever the conditions are on the ground for these local groups. They're picking their own sheikhs now. We see this in a debate going on actually in Pakistan, which is fascinating. You had 9 or 10 folks in Pakistan come out and pledge loyalty to ISIS. Just last week, Al-Qaeda Central published a statement from clerics refuting these 9 for why they're wrong for joining ISIS. That ideology is malleable, and it will change based on the connections that are on the ground and the situation and the power plays. 3 years ago, everybody would tell me that the ideology was so binding and pure that there would never be infighting in this organization. The 3 S's have proved this to be completely false. The first one is Somalia. There have been fractures in Somalia, and they became more severe once Godani pledged his bayat to Al-Qaeda Central, and Al-Qaeda Central recognized it with Shabab. There had been all sorts of connections with Shabab. They wanted to pledge loyalty. They thought they did to Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden was really nervous about those guys for a good reason, probably, and sort of rebuffed them. And if you read Omar Hamami's bio, they talk about there 2 or 3 times where there would be these Game of Thrones power plays about who was pledging the oath to Bin Laden. And they would use that as a tool to corral all these clans underneath them. And as soon as they did that, local conditions would take over and they would all start fracturing. You'd see Awais, who's been around for 20, 25 years with loose connections to Al-Qaeda here. Sometimes he's with them, sometimes he's against them. He shows up in the Harmony documents. What is going on? They can't control it. Al-Qaeda really can't control it. They don't have the control that they did under bin Laden's era. And what really shows after all this ideological stuff is when personnel and resource problems arise, oaths of loyalty and ideology will shift to whatever those guys need to do to survive and however they want to propel themselves. The second S is in the Sahel. There was limited communication. Those letters are great because they do show the communication like AQAP to AQIM and how they're trying to reach out to Zawahiri. But when you keep sending out a message to the boss and he never answers you back, or because of the digital Pony Express, which is where you take a little thumb drive and the courier goes and then he sends the message, it takes 3 weeks for that to happen and come back from Pakistan. You do what? You're on your own. You start making your own plans. You start giving your own interpretations of the ideology, and it's usually a convenient version of that. The Sahel is the second S, and the third one, which I'm sure we'll come back to, is what's going on in Syria right now. The number one killer of jihadis in Syria is other jihadis right now. It's not the U.S. And why? That ideology isn't that strong enough. They have difference of opinion based on it, but there's also resource and personnel issues that are there. There's a huge leadership problem right now in Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden, charismatic, great with ideology, resonated, and he had money. He had resources. He was from the Gulf, the heart of the foreign fighters that come into these conflicts. Who do you got now there? Zawahiri. Not a lot of fun to be with, kind of a bad boss. Very smart, though, strategically, right? He's always reaching out, trying to make plans. Doesn't command the resources. These guys have gone off on their own now, a lot of these affiliates. They're resourcing themselves. And so what happens? He can't communicate with them on a routine basis, and he starts to lose control. They start choosing their own direction. The smartest thing he did, which he did try to do, was a smart play, was nominating the emir of AQAP, Wuhaishi, to be the deputy of Al-Qaeda. Why did he do that? This is Game of Thrones, folks. You can watch it on HBO. Just change the names, okay? Why did he do that? He needed a Gulf guy to try and keep that in line. He didn't have that. Remember, he's from Egypt. He's got a lot of connections into LIFG, Al-Jihad from Egypt days. He did that. That was a strategic power play. I got to have my Gulf guy. Number 2, AQAP was the winner. They're the only ones that were getting some success trying to do external operations against the West. And you can tell it from our actions. Drones don't go and make terrorists. Drones go where terrorists at. So if you want to know where the strength of Al-Qaeda's movement and their plots are, all you got to do is look at where those blips are in those drone strikes and where they're going and what the intensity is. So when I hear the ideological discussion, I get really, really nervous because it reminds me of where we were 12 years ago, which was a highly expansive ideology was used to justify action on many, many levels. And so we were pursuing what we called terrorists who had very weak or different intent, capability, and commitment to striking the West. And instead of actually eliminating threats, we were probably making more of them in some of these places. We were providing impetus, right? It was called Iraq. We made a second generation of foreign fighters in that conflict, whether we like it or not, but that's what happened. The only thing that's good about this in some ways is it's created this enormous dissension in the rank, because there's a lot of dissension between the first generation of foreign fighters, which is that group from Afghanistan that made the original Al-Qaeda, and as Mary rightly pointed out, they all have physical relationships with each other. So it wasn't just the ideology that bound them, they actually worked together and teamed together. Bin Laden and Zawahiri, they missed out on the second generation in Iraq. Who are those guys? Those are Zarqawi's boys. And Zarqawi had his own interpretations. And we saw that back in 2006, which I think Mary talks about really well in her article, the differences between Zarqawi and Zawahiri and the old guard guys about targeting, direction, and ideology. My final point is, I am very focused on the strains that are most, committed to attacking the U.S. I think the ideology is a wild hare that we can chase all over the place. And all of these groups have components of the ideology, but they're also debating internally about their commitment to different portions of it. So that's sort of my take on that as an Al-Qaeda definition. It's too expansive for me.
Mary, just to respond to the idea that ideology isn't fundamentally how we see Al-Qaeda, I know that it's changed over the past 12 years, where when we first started the war on terror, it really was a way where we had a very expansive view of what the ideology is, but I know you've been studying it and have a much more refined idea of exactly what that ideology is and how to differentiate between, say, there's Zarqawis, who some might argue aren't part of that core Al-Qaeda, and the Nasrallah Hashis in Yemen, who actually do subscribe to the ideology.
Actually, just starting there, 12 years ago, or 13, nearly 13 years ago, ideology was in fact dismissed by most people in the previous administration. And in fact, there was sort of a cap put on it. What the administration at that time looked at was jihadism. That is, were people engaged in violence? And that's really all they cared about. And they didn't distinguish between different groups by their ideology. And in fact, defined the threat so broadly, it included tons of jihadist groups that weren't in tune with Al-Qaeda, its methodology, and its ideology. So I would say actually there was very little attention paid to it 12 to 13 years ago. That changed sometime around 2005, 2006, when people began to be interested in ideology. They began to distinguish between groups based on that. So instead of saying any group that engages in violence of any sort is a danger to the United States, they began to say, okay, which groups have an ideology that compels them to attack the United States first? Because that's part of Al-Qaeda's methodology and ideology, to attack the United States rather than other local governments. So by looking at that, they were able to distinguish amongst groups and actually narrow the definition of the enemy from that broad, expansive first definition they had right after 9/11. But getting back to this question of whether ideology is even important, let me just say where I agree with you. Pragmatism absolutely plays a role in nearly everything that Al-Qaeda does. They're an extremely pragmatic group, especially when it comes to military matters. If you read some of the things they've written about Mao, about Castro's experience in Cuba, you name it, Giap, they love Giap. One of their best military leaders, in fact, wrote his master's thesis on Giap and thought that Giap was the model to follow in order to defeat the United States. After all, the last time somebody defeated the United States was in Vietnam, right? So if we follow what Giap did, maybe we'll be able to do the same thing. So very, very pragmatic when it comes to military matters, when it comes to some economic matters, when it comes to a lot of different issues. But you'll notice, Clint, that the examples that you gave were all about them actually engaging with each other and arguing over ideology. And if ideology really doesn't matter, why in the world did they even do that? I mean, that's, it's one thing to say, someplace back in, the depths of your heart, I don't believe this, or I'm not doing this because of ideology, but why even engage in it in this kind of public debate and make ideology the center for your argument if you don't actually believe that it has some significance? So in fact, ideology was the motivation for Zawahiri to write a 700-page book called The Exoneration, in which he took on the arguments, the changed arguments of one of his mentors, one of the sort of godfathers of jihad, as it were, in Egypt, and argued against his ideological interpretations in order to show people where he had gone astray. If you read through a lot of the things that they say, the very first part, middle part, and the end part is all about the ideological justifications for what we're doing. And as I mentioned, the main dispute between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Central, if you want to call them that, is about their change in creed and methodology. And in fact, they're engaging in an ideological struggle with each other over the future of Al-Qaeda. And here's one of the implications of that. The particular minhaj, the particular methodology that ISIS has chosen to follow, follows that of Zarqawi. And in fact, some people call the split, the sort of Zawahiri-Zarqawi split, right? And when it comes to Zarqawi's views of fighting, he believed that, well, you should take care not to kill innocent civilians right up to the point where it impinges on your military operations, right? In other words, he talked about not killing civilians, but if it was going to make you give up an operation that was really worth it, really a sweet operation, he believed you should just go ahead with it. And if you killed 50 innocent Muslims and killed one American in exchange, that was perfectly fine. And he also believed in carrying out invoking, in fact, and causing a sectarian war with the Shia, and spent a lot of his time killing innocent Shia in order to set off a sectarian war. I mean, how many people can say, that they purposely set out to cause sectarian and civil wars? But he wrote about that, and in fact, that's exactly what he started to do. So his vision of methodology and of creed said, it is perfectly fine for us to do this. In fact, he had people write justifications, ulema, write him justifications for doing this. On the other hand, Zawahiri has constantly said that it is wrong to kill innocent Muslims, and he has put a lot of pressure on those who have sworn bayat to him to live up to that. And the changed behavior that we've seen as a result of that in places like Somalia, where, if you'll remember, the Shabab who carried out the horrible terrorist attack in Kenya, one of the things they did was attempt to figure out who was a Muslim and who was not a Muslim before they started randomly shooting people, killing, by the way, a lot of Muslims in the meantime. But they actually asked people a set of questions to try to figure out if they were Muslims before they carried out their attack. Nobody had done anything like this before Zawahiri put out his statement saying, this is what you're going to do, and here is the Sharia justifications for it. Here is what the ulema say, and from now on, those who follow our methodology are going to be doing this. If you go back and take a look at El Adnani's bitter complaint against Zawahiri that he just put out a few weeks ago, he's the spokesman for ISIS. He says repeatedly, you have left the original methodology. You have left the original creed. And we are following on in Zarqawi and Osama bin Laden's footsteps, and you are not going to change this on us. So for him, ideology actually mattered. Now, you gave 3 examples of splits and arguments. Let's start with the Somalia one. As I've already suggested, they seem to be taking some kind of direction from Al-Qaeda because that note from Zawahiri came out, a public statement about these are the things we want to do, we want to see, and this occurred several months after that came out. So one could make an argument, well, it sounds like they're actually doing what he had to say. But more importantly, all of those splits that you mentioned about have gone away. So all the people who are going to leave have either left or been killed by Godani. And just recently, Shabab reaffirmed its allegiance to Al-Qaeda Central, twice. So on the 12th and the 14th, they reaffirmed their allegiance. The Sahel, there have been arguments. Al-Mukhtar had a terrible argument with Abdel Wadud, or Drukdel, as he's sometimes called. Drukdel is the head of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and Al-Mukhtar is the head of a group that called itself those who have signed themselves in blood, right? Which is, I don't know why you'd want to call yourself that, but I guess that was what he thought best expressed his group's orientation. Terrible argument, an argument that came out in those Mali documents, even more clearly than it had in press reporting about this. But what also became clear over time is that something had happened to settle this, because Bil Mukhtar went off and joined up with El Murabitun, and in fact was not made the head of El Murabitun, a new group that was put off someplace else in the Sahel. And El Murabitun, in other words, he was willing to be under somebody else, a guy who wasn't named until just like a month ago when he was killed, and was willing to, again, swear his allegiance to Al-Qaeda just a month ago. So end of April, April 30th, he also came forward and said, no, I have my allegiance to Al-Qaeda Central and to Zawahiri. And finally, when it comes to Syria, the major argument that's going on there, as I said, is between ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra. So ISIS is the breakaway group, and Jabhat al-Nusra, or the Nusra Front, are the guys who have definitely declared their allegiance to Zawahiri. But I've been watching very carefully to see what other groups are signing up with ISIS versus those that are signing up with Jabhat al-Nusra. And the results are about 20 or 30 to 1 of the groups that are signing up with Jabhat al-Nusra versus those who are signing up with ISIS. Al-Qaeda, in other words, is winning out.
I think we'll circle back to the Iraq-Syria divide shortly, but I actually want to come back to a point that Clinton made about pragmatism. So this is setting aside the ideology and actually looking at the leaders on the ground that have to make the decisions. And I think part of your argument, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that over the past few years, what has happened with Al-Qaeda and the death of bin Laden, it's lost its central leadership. The Arab Spring has happened. We've seen decentralization.
Right.
There's a lot more autonomy for these groups, and now they essentially are self-funded, self-starters, and kind of like the generation today on Twitter,
right,
are looking to venture out and be their own startups. So how does that pragmatism play into Al-Qaeda, and what actually is the state of Al-Qaeda today? Is there still
right,
cooperation, coordination, or are we looking at much more of an individualized actor?
right. So Al-Qaeda is getting killed today for the same reasons that we get worried about, like, our young employees being on social media. It's fascinating to watch. And J.M. Berger, if you're familiar with Intel Wire, he's really the one that sort of was putting this together. They could kind of keep some centralized control. And like back in 2006 and 2007, we were like, oh, the internet is this panacea for Al-Qaeda. It's really helping them, branch out, keep their message out there. And that was very true. But as the internet has evolved into this social media, this two-way engagement, it's unraveled on them much in the way it unravels on us when we want to control message. So like the goofy White House employee that starts a bogus Twitter account and starts making stupid comments, and you see stuff like this all the time. So they're having a hard time right now, and I would tell you to read two things that I think are really excellent that are out there right now for understanding how things are playing out, not just with Al-Qaeda, but just in terms of terrorism in general. The first one is by Jake Shapiro at Princeton. It's called The Terrorist Dilemma. He does a great discussion about how ideology and pragmatism play against each other, and he deconstructs it from this Al-Qaeda thing that we've been talking about for 12 years. So he uses lots of different case studies. The other one is RAND just put out a report this week talking about the decentralization, essentially, of terrorism and how Al-Qaeda is really like just one group in this morass of different organizations that are out there, and that there's all these sorts of debates about direction and pragmatism and what we should be doing within these groups. So if you want to know when Al-Qaeda Central does well, or old guard Al-Qaeda, which I focus on, it comes down to just a few things. One, success versus failure. The reason that AQ is having to compete right now just to be top dog in their own jihadi communities is because they haven't been hitting home runs lately. Their external attacks happened back 2005, 2002, when let's say Westgate was an Al-Qaeda attack, they kind of aren't taking tons of credit for it, and they're using like proxies for it. Young folks, foreign fighters right now that are motivated are going to ISIS, because ISIS in the jihadi world is a winner. They are doing attacks. And the other thing that's really fascinating to watch that I didn't expect was they're really attracted to this idea of building an Islamic state. They're really excited about it. And some of the pushback that goes against Al-Qaeda with this is you guys have not succeeded in putting together a state. It's been us out here working on this. The other thing you got to remember when it comes to success and failure, most recruits right now are 18 to 24 years old. How old were they on 9/11? They were young. This was something they saw and they knew about. It was in their communities. What rallied them was more Iraq and Yemen and these other affiliate locations. So success has not been held strictly within the Old Guard al-Qaeda network. It's being achieved by a lot of different jihadi groups. And if you want to attract foreign fighters and resources, you better be hitting home runs. You better be doing attacks. It's a reciprocal relationship. And that brings us to the next thing, which is resources. During the bin Laden era, and this is what's fascinating about the Abbottabad documents, is you see people all the way up till bin Laden's death going to bin Laden, essentially asking him both for like strategic guidance, and wouldn't it be great if you could cough up $100 so we could like do this? There's still that discussion in the background about resource allocation. Even into Palestine, there's some interesting things that are there that show that kind of network and control. Zawahiri doesn't have it. And Greg Johnson, who wrote the book on AQAP, The Last Refuge, has got a great quote in there. Bin Laden, was a jihadi just like all the others, except he had one thing that was different, and that he had money, and he knew how to organize and resource things. And when you go back to the 90s, we had this National Geographic special about how al-Qaeda originated, through about 8 or 9 years. But then when you look at like Zubaydah's diaries, he was like, I'm the man in jihad. But bin Laden's got a little money, so I'll go ask bin Laden for a little bit of money. But I am the leader. And so success really brought a lot of al-Qaeda together, especially during that intermediate period. Since Zawahiri's leadership, that has really been distributed. And now you see what I call yo-yo resourcing, you on your own. And so these groups, once they start resourcing on their own, you and I right now could crowdfund a group in Syria if we wanted to on Twitter. We can literally pledge money to a group. So as resource control gets limited for al-Qaeda and they can't control it, if the boss isn't paying you, you start to do more of what you want than what the boss wants. You're always going to keep that connection there, and you want to keep that going. It's very political. The next part that I want to make sure we talk about is the physical relationships, and that is really what's going on today. We deceived ourselves in thinking that the internet would keep all of al-Qaeda adherents around 2005 to 7 loyal to each other. That was wrong. We were wrong. The power of the Zarqawi legions that fought in Iraq is really what's going on today. And you see it with these militias that have risen up, first in Yemen, Ansar al-Sharia in Yemen. It's a parallel thing that they built. But there's fascinating discussion, especially in open source, about Ansar al-Sharia in Yemen is doing something really great. I would love it if Wahishi would just go with them, or sort of like move them out and go with ISIS. So there's a really unique dynamic that's going on there. In those legions, in that legion that fought in Iraq, there are 2 nodes that are of critical importance for understanding the ISIS AQ, Old Guard AQ split and where things will go in the future. The first one are the foreign fighters from Libya and Tunisia. And actually, I'll just show where this rift is. Yeah. We'll use this one. So these are some scenarios I'll talk about here in a second. Should I do that now, Katie? I'm sort of like blending into it, and we'll just jump to the end. So there are 2 nodes that are really critical. Foreign fighters from Libya and Tunisia in North Africa, and foreign fighters from Yemen and Saudi in the Gulf. And they really are the ones that will decide what direction this goes. That is where you see the debate about should we be on Team ISIS or should we be in Old Guard al-Qaeda. There's a debate amongst the young people. Young people are motivated by ISIS because they've got really sharp media. They're committing lots of violence. They're going after Islamic State. They're also dumber, and so they tend to make more mistakes. Old Guard al-Qaeda, on the other hand, is staying loyal and true to their values. They're screening their foreign fighter recruits to make sure that they don't have any moles, in their systems. They're being much smarter, but if you can't win over the resources, and this is really like Zawahiri's challenge right now in al-Qaeda, if you can't win over the people and you don't command the resources, you're in a very, very bad situation. So I'll lay out 3 scenarios, and that's what those dynamics have come from. The first one is that you could see really the 2 poles emerge. One, which I call Old Guard al-Qaeda, which are these groups and the ones that they have the tightest connections with in Syria. And then over time, all of these sort of foreign fighters that are motivated slip over to be kind of an ISIS sort of a network. With that, you'll still have a lot of these groups now that are just waiting it out. So some people interpret this as like, yeah, I pledged loyalty to al-Qaeda. And so like Mary said, there's like 30 groups that are loyal to al-Qaeda. But if I'm not getting money from the boss and he's not communicating with me that much, and I don't really need to pick sides, then what am I going to do? I'm just going to wait and see which way things go. And I'll play the middle, and I'll run my own stuff here, wherever it might be. If it's the Sahara, if it's in Nigeria, if it's in Somalia, I'll hedge the middle, and I won't commit until I have to. I mean, we know this from elections in our own country, right? We all wait to see who the candidate is, and then suddenly he was our choice from the beginning, okay? So that's scenario number one. Scenario number two is what I think is really kind of going on today, which is fascinating to watch. And I'll give you, these are three scenarios because if anybody tells you they're an Al-Qaeda expert and can tell you which way this is going to go, man, you should show them the door. They don't know what they're talking about. There's way too much going on. This is essentially, we just have Nusra and Old Guard Al-Qaeda, LNOs, with a bunch of different groups in Syria that are battling it out against ISIS and any sort of connections that they can build. And this is a sustained sort of, I call it Al-Qaeda internal civil war, where the jihadis are just fighting at each other. Sounds great a little bit, right? So this is the scenario right now in Syria. We've got jihadis fighting jihadis who are fighting Hezbollah, who are fighting the IRGC, who are fighting Assad, and they're all fighting each other, and then there's some Kurds in the mix, and you go, if I'm strictly from a counterterrorism perspective, what's not to like? These guys are all chewing themselves up, and it's a meat grinder. And the effect over the long run is donors say, I don't want to donate a bunch of money if you're going to just kill other jihadis or get into a sectarian conflict. If you're a foreign fighter, you start to say, oh man, I thought I was just coming here to participate in jihad and be part of Al-Qaeda, and I'm mostly attacking my brothers or I'm fighting Shia. It has a corrosive effect. And so today you see foreign fighters coming back, and this is a key issue right now. This is that blowback we're seeing in Europe. Europe should be very worried. So should North Africa. We see these guys coming back because they're disillusioned with what's going on in terms of this conflict. Doesn't mean that they're not going to be committed to violence. They'll still be jihadis. But this civil war has a really corrosive effect. The third one is that there's so much infighting and things are going poorly that you stick with where you can resource and work together the best and where you can communicate the best. And where does that really happen? It happens regionally, in sort of regional nodes. So you see groups like Shabab working with other groups in Kenya, and they work together. They occasionally have contact, and they still communicate. I don't doubt that with Al-Qaeda Central, and they probably do with ISIS as well. And they sort of swarm around. Same thing in the desert, you'll see this. You've got AQIM, they'll break into 3 or 4 variants. They'll all communicate. Al-Qaeda will try and control. From ISIS, a lot of the young veterans will kind of be like, oh, we should start our own group. Everyone's like choosing their own best path, and this is that local versus global debate. What you might see is all 3 of these scenarios, but play out in a sequence. I don't know what the sequence will be. I would love to have all the counterterrorism analysts put their bets down on how this will play out, because it would be fascinating to see who would be right in the end. I really think we're probably seeing civil war first, maybe some version of could ISIS become the global leader, although they've kind of acted dumb recently, so maybe they won't. And then maybe you just have regional conglomerates over the longer run, 18 months and beyond. So those are sort of the scenarios. That's where I see sort of Al-Qaeda going. What Al-Qaeda, Old Guard Al-Qaeda needs to do is, 1, they got to start getting on top of foreign fighter recruitment again. 2, they got to start securing resources and distributing. 3, they got to make a plot to become the sort of dominant player. And that comes with 2 most dangerous scenarios. 1, if I was Al-Qaeda, Old Guard Al-Qaeda, Zawahiri right now, I'd be going through Nusra, going through my LNOs in Syria, and I would attack Israel right now. Why attack Israel? It puts everybody back on your side. Everybody wants, that's a common enemy of all of those groups in the region, and you force the U.S., who's been sitting on the sidelines, to have to make a decision. Whose team are you going to be on? Are you going to go with the Gulf? Or are you going to go with Israel? Choose your alliances. You have to make a decision. The other most dangerous scenario that I think is out there, and this really comes from this scenario, and I'm really worried about this week now that I've seen like ISIS is trying these external attacks, is you get competition. So if you're Zawahiri and you really want to put yourself as the global leader again, you do a big external operations attack. That's another thing that you can do. It draws all the attention back to you. It shows that your dominance. What I think ISIS is doing is that ramp up. Oh, okay, we want to be the global leader. What do? We're going to do an attack in Saudi Arabia, and we'll have somebody shoot up something, and we'll do an attack in Europe. Luckily, they're dumber and they're moving quickly, whereas Old Guard Al-Qaeda is smarter and more pragmatic, and they'll sort of line things up. So that's kind of where I think things will go.
Great. A lot to unpack there, Mary. And I actually would like to circle back long-term to the ISIS question, and especially given Adnani's statement from a couple weeks ago. But first, let's look at what the state of Al-Qaeda is today, according to you. And Clint laid out what he saw as kind of a movement that is much more localized and is fighting resources, and an Al-Qaeda core that essentially has been sidelined because Zawahiri's pockets aren't as deep, because he is afraid to kill Muslims, probably from his experience in Egypt. And frankly, he's just not as good-looking guy as bin Laden. So how do you see al-Qaeda today?
Okay, so I'd like to actually begin with something that I think is underlying some of our different views of al-Qaeda, and that is your vision of their objectives versus my vision of their objectives. So al-Qaeda is generally defined as a terrorist group. That's how most people think about them. They carry out terrorist attacks. Isn't that what their main purpose is, to attack America? I mean, throughout the 1990s, they put out, several official fatwas saying this, and then lots and lots and lots of interviews by the non-media shy bin Laden talking about how he would love to kill Americans, right? And they actually attempted to do that several times. They carried out attacks in East Africa against the coal and so on and so forth. But in fact, al-Qaeda has always had a second side to it that was taking up the vast majority of its funding, time, and effort during the 1990s, at least according to the 9/11 Commission report. 99% of its funding was in fact going to creating what they called mujahideen, that is guerrilla fighters, for a long-term insurgency rather than the 1% that was being spent on external attacks, that is terrorist attacks. Now, if an organization spends 99% of its money on one effort and only 1% on the other effort, on what basis do we focus on that 1% versus the 99%? Well, I'll tell you what basis. Because that 1% was aimed at us. And isn't that the important thing? What's going to affect us and Americans? It certainly is for Americans. We don't pay attention to that 99%. We don't pay attention to all that other messy stuff going out there that al-Qaeda has said from the beginning was their real objective. That is to overthrow every single local leader in the Muslim majority world and replace them with people who would follow their version, their extremist version of Sharia. That is their underlying objective. Attacking America was in fact just a means towards that end, because they saw America as the main stumbling block towards achieving that end. The US always shows up. We're always there with funding, we're always there with troops, we're always there messing up their plans for world domination. I mean, seriously, that's how bin Laden talked in the 1990s. We have some captured documents from Afghanistan back in 2002 that show this. He called himself, in fact, and the people around him, I suppose he had to say this, to you too, although it was really all about him. We are a government in exile for the entire Muslim world. That's how he saw himself, and that was in 2000, a year before he had carried out 9/11. He, in fact, warned them, something big's coming. Something big's going to come that's going to change the entire calculus out there, and then we have to start considering ourselves for what we really are, a government in exile for the entire Muslim majority world. So right from the start, they had bigger plans than simply carrying out attacks against the United States. And I'm glad you pointed out that they haven't carried out attacks against the United States. And yet, as you say, they have managed to recruit more and more and more people to their cause, to their ideology, and to their methodology for carrying out this war. And the reason they've done that is through insurgencies. So insurgencies in Iraq, but more importantly for today, and you mentioned this younger group, and rightly so, more importantly for them is Syria. Syria is acting as a huge radicalizing force without the presence of the United States. By the way, this is a great falsification of a proposal that was put forward by people, that it's the presence of the United States that radicalizes people and that turns them into jihadists. Well, it turns out you don't need the presence of the United States. It is, in fact, the absence of the United States that is radicalizing people in Syria right now. And the U.S. is not present in any of these fights that are going on around the world, and yet more and more people are being radicalized through this. So I have to say that if you just look at what they were focusing on in the 1990s and what they're doing today, and as for Zawahiri being a failure, I'd like to just go through to, sorry about the change, and if I'd known the different sort of formatting I would have chosen. So here's al-Qaeda linked terrorism in 2011, before the death of bin Laden, right? The great leader, founder, charismatic guy who is going to lead us forward into tomorrow. But here's, in fact, where things were at in 2011, just before his death. This is where al-Qaeda terrorism was occurring at a level that can be called serious. That doesn't mean there weren't other terrorist attacks in other places, for instance, India, but actually by 2011 that was slowly being wrapped up by Indian counterterrorism folks. But by 2011, this is basically where serious terrorism is being carried out by people who claimed a relationship with Al-Qaeda, right? Here's Al-Qaeda terrorism in 2014. And I have a big question mark on Xinjiang because I'm just not certain who's doing this. The Chinese government says it's Etim. The methodology that's being used resonates. It looks like Al-Qaeda to me, but it's uncertain. But it's certainly people who are being inspired by, who think Al-Qaeda is worth emulating. And so I include this here as well. But if you take a look from Kenya all the way up to the Caucasus, there's more violence being carried out than in 2011. If that's failure, that's the kind of failure any CEO of a company wants to see. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Here are Al-Qaeda insurgencies in 2011. As you can see, I call what was going on in Iraq at that time a high level, but still manageable terrorism. They were no longer able to keep and hold territory. They were having trouble recruiting people. The people of Iraq had turned against them, and successfully, with the surge that the United States carried out along with them, able to kick out most of the Al-Qaeda terrorists and insurgents. So there were really only 3 places where there were serious insurgencies, what I call embedded insurgencies, that is mature insurgencies occurring. 3 places, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, that had some sort, northern Pakistan, of course, some sort of connection with Al-Qaeda. Here's Al-Qaeda insurgencies in 2014. Again, if this is failure, this is the kind of failure that we all want to see. And for a guy who has no charisma, and I agree, the guy has no charisma, but everybody always said he was the smart one. They said he was the one who was the planner, the guy who always had something up his sleeve, who knew how to do things, and was willing to think long term, 5, 10, 15, 20 years into the future, rather than go for the short-term gain. And what we see here is in country after country, Al-Qaeda influenced, Al-Qaeda linked groups using my definition of Al-Qaeda. And even if you don't use it, those people who believe in Al-Qaeda's ideology and Al-Qaeda's methodology for carrying this out are engaged in insurgencies in about a dozen countries today. So if that's failure, that's the kind of failure I think we all want to see. You had a second piece to that, then perhaps we can.
I
kind of need to
to
respond to
this one.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So, I don't know if any of you guys have ever been in defense contracting community. This slide is what we call the moneymaker right there. All right, this is scary Al-Qaeda map. I've been doing these since 2004, at least. I worked at the Combating Terrorism Center. That's our shock and awe PowerPoint slide. Boom, scary Al-Qaeda map. Okay, we throw that thing out there. We're giving Zawahiri way too much credit for a lot of things that aren't his doing, or even that of Al-Qaeda. Lots of these places, and a great one is like every article when AQIM was like on their boom in 2012, really taking over, building a caliphate. Every article said they created the largest caliphate in the history of mankind. And it should have said in parentheses, which also happens to be the largest pile of sand on the planet. They operate in a lot of these places. But look at what happens when we decide, this kind of goes into the counterterrorism, when we decide to do something. The French, remember that country we bailed out in World War II? They ran those guys out of Mali in a week. Holy cow. Never saw that coming, okay? When we decide we want to do something, when we decide that there's a threat to us, we can do it. We're circling whole countries here and basically laying out an assumption that this is a threat to an entire country, or that Al-Qaeda controls an entire country. Somalia, Puntland, Somaliland. We're talking about South and Central Somalia, and a declining ratio at that. You can actually read the series on Shabab, and they actually map out. It's really good. I think Al Jazeera had done it too, where they show where this decline is. Zawahiri's resume, if we go by this metric, is a lot like the resume of anyone when you get it in the inbox and they're only 24 years old, and suddenly they've had like 13 jobs and 14 publications or something like that, and you go, how did this person do this? And they're only 24. We're giving them a lot of credit for things that are chaotically going on. And a lot of these insurgencies right now are shooting themselves in the foot for jihad. They are out of control. They're violent. They're not even pursuing things in line with bin Laden or Zawahiri's objectives. Great example from 2 weeks ago, Boko Haram. We get all upset about Boko Haram, right? They kidnap these women and sell them off. Probably not something that bin Laden or Zawahiri would recommend. And the article said, the first article I read said, Al-Qaeda-linked group Boko Haram kidnaps and sells off women. Okay, we're giving them a lot of credit again. Yeah, the first thing I bring up is bin Laden in 2003 or 4 gave some money to start up a training camp for Boko Haram. Look, if we're upset about trafficking of women, we don't need to go find an Al-Qaeda connection. Why do we do this? And Mary is right, the AUMF, Armed Use of Military Force, that's the only way we can mobilize or do things around what we want to do. These insurgencies are not going to be successful in a lot of cases, and in some ways are weakening Al-Qaeda because they're going way out of the bounds in terms of violence, ISIS being a great example. They're weakening their popular support in the local areas. And eventually, and this is an example from Algeria. If you've ever looked at the GSPC, GIA back in the day, they used a strategy which was called let it rot. It was like, okay, you want to build your caliphate, you go do that. They would literally perimeter it off, and they'd say, you go caliphate all day long. And they would wait until what? The businessmen would start to come out. You know, the families started to come out and be like, hey, you know, we thought caliphate was going to be great. Turned out it wasn't so great. So, like, we're open to working with you or bringing you back in. Now, I never want to recommend any counterterrorism options that the Algerians go with for a lot of different reasons. But when you talk about all these insurgencies, it is a great point that Mary brought up. I don't think they're mostly sitting around thinking about the U.S. I don't. They use the U.S. as a boogeyman, really, for whatever their objectives are locally. They use them to rally support and motivation with donors. And so I am of the opposite perspective, that we don't need to get involved in all these insurgencies. We did that for the past decade. It didn't go so well. We spent a lot of money. We instead created weak democracies, which could not function as good counterterrorism partners. We created safe havens in Iraq, which now hosts ISIS. Depending on your perspective, we could say ISIS is of our own birth. We created that safe haven for them. And we have no ability right now to counter them because of our own domestic politics. We can't come to a way in terms of how we want to fight it. So I'll kind of stop there because I know we're going into counterterrorism discussion, but that's my perspective on the insurgencies.
I do feel for Mary, having tried to map Al-Qaeda groups in the desert and trying to figure out whether
Very
you
tough.
paint the sand or you just paint the villages.
That's right.
Because at the end of the day, it is a lot of territory, and it's not the same as the Fatah. But Mary, I know that you have something to say here, and I also feel that we should start bringing the definitions and ideology back into it, because I think that's actually where you two are disagreeing, and that's what's bringing out the difference in your assessments here, where for Mary, I think the long-term objectives of the insurgency are quite different than how Clint is seeing them.
I don't think I disagree on long-term objectives.
Okay.
I think I disagree on how they're going to have to get there based on current situation.
So just briefly, I affirm and support you on the issue of our partners and friends fighting back and doing a terrific job. The French went into Mali and literally within just a few weeks had kicked out the vast majority of the Al-Qaeda guys there. Unfortunately, they almost immediately infiltrated back in and started carrying out attacks. And right now, the French are in serious trouble, actually, and having to come to a decision point of whether they should just withdraw or bring in more troops, because they're nearly at mission failure there. And the same thing could be said about Yemen. The Yemeni government put its best effort in 2012 into kicking out the Al-Qaeda guys there, did a great job, except that all the Al-Qaeda guys just melted into the mountains and into the desert. In fact, that's what they did in Mali. It's actually a Maoist technique that I think that they've adopted, which is when the enemy advances, you retreat. You take all of your weapons, you take all of your people, and you simply go off to the mountains, wait until they get done with their little doodad down there in the valleys and down there in the villages, and then whenever they've gotten tired of it, you go down and start carrying out attacks, and when they're weakest, you find their weak spots and keep attacking them until they're attrited, that is, depleted enough that you can go ahead and just push them out. And that's what they're doing right now in Yemen and Somalia. So Somalia, absolutely, they only control a few districts, a few areas, but they're able to carry out, again, attacks inside of Mogadishu, which they had been prevented from doing so for a couple of years. And once again, they've risen to the capability and ability to carry out those attacks. Now, I don't want to make it sound like, Debbie Downer here. There's no solution. In fact, I think there is a solution. But I'm just putting forward that this is not a map of success here. This is a map of al-Qaeda advancing while we retreat. So if I can, I'd like to answer as well the points that you brought forward about the split between ISIS and al-Qaeda, which I think is a serious issue. I don't want to downplay that in any way, shape, or form. That is a serious issue, and one that, if it goes towards ISIS, could lead to absolutely a split and the destruction of al-Qaeda as we know it. The biggest question that I have as a military historian is, will that lead to less violence or more violence? Now, if we were dealing with a terrorist group, the answer would be almost certainly more violence. Because when groups split, they usually don't carry out terrorist groups against each other, or terrorist attacks against each other. They compete with each other, in fact, and carry out more and more terrorist attacks in an attempt to win funding, recruits people to their side. So with a terrorist group, actually splintering is a very, very bad thing. It leads to more violence, not less. And basically decapitation, I hate to use that term, but is the way forward that most people see for a terrorist group. With an insurgency, it's a little more ambiguous. You can find examples on both sides, but it's not by any means a given that splintering an insurgent group will lead to less violence. And again, it has to do with whether they turn their violence outward and compete or whether they fight against each other. The evidence we're getting right now from ISIS and AQ is that they are both doing both. So you mentioned that there are cells that are being picked up in other countries that have their allegiance to ISIS. That is a bad thing. If ISIS actually wins out, there will be more violence, not less. ISIS, in fact, were the ones who believed in not putting the gloves on, who believed that you had to carry out as many attacks as possible and kill randomly as many people as possible. If you take a look at what Shekau has been doing in northern Nigeria, in some ways, that reminds me very much of what Zarqawi did and what the ISIS group would be doing if they were, given their full steam and allowed to do whatever they want. So while we may look at this and say, hey, they're splintering up, they're fighting each other, that is not necessarily a good thing. But beyond that, I actually have a little teeny bit of an issue with the map as it currently is displayed, because I went through meticulously each group and went looking for what their stated position is on the ISIS-AQ split. And I realized that perhaps, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, this might be based on some false assumptions. So it looks to me, just as an outsider looking at this and at your explanation in your 3 articles.
I can already tell you how we're going to diverge on this, but go ahead.
Okay. It looks to me that
You're already talking about official statements?
No,
I'm not.
wait a second.
I don't care about those.
Let me
It's not what
finish,
it's
and then you
based
can
on.
criticize me. So it looks to me that the burden of proof is on the group to affirm or reaffirm allegiance to al-Qaeda, right? So the burden of proof is on them to come out with some sort of public statement about their relationship with al-Qaeda. If a group doesn't state rejection of ISIS or allegiance to al-Qaeda, in other words, they're sort of neutral, they're assumed to be wavering, right? They're in play.
No,
And
that's
that's-
not how I
okay.
made that assessment. But if you want to call it that, you can. I'll just tell you how
Yeah,
I did
please
it
do,
afterwards.
because I'm going to continue on, and then you can criticize the whole thing. If ordinary members use social media to support ISIS, they're assumed to be leaning ISIS.
No.
Really? That's what I got from Ansar Sharia, for instance.
Right. So here's how I made this
Wait.
assessment.
Let me get the
All right,
third one.
if
Okay.
you-
And then
if
you
you
can
wanna do
criticize
that,
the whole
yeah.
thing in one go, right?
Okay.
If 1 or 2 lower-ranking leaders, like the 2 guys from ACAP,
Yep.
or the central group that nobody's heard of before but suddenly declared themselves to be the
Right.
head of
Which could be a
Camp-
complete false flag.
Right.
Right.
They're assumed to be with ISIS. Those are the guys that you have down there in
Right.
green, right? Okay, if you turn that around and simply made those assumptions for al-Qaeda, this is what you would get. In fact, you would have only 2 or 3 groups that are aligned with ISIS, and the rest would all be aligned with al-Qaeda. Now, which of those is true or false depends, I believe, on whether people have come forward in the last few weeks, last few months, and have specifically stated, I am with al-Qaeda and I reject ISIS, or I reject ISIS. Okay, so I went through each one of those groups and looked for that.
Right.
Okay.
So as it says up
So-
there, estimate.
Okay.
So on the top of it, when I'm trying to put up an estimate, It's an imperfect model. And I don't like the org charts that I see a lot of times in DoD, which are like line and block charts, and they go, Al-Qaeda Group 1 commands Al-Qaeda Group 2, 3, 4. We do that because PowerPoint sort of makes us do that, right? It's like, it's true. I mean, we kind of get into that like we're trying to make top-down charts. That's what we're trained to do in the military. Put stars and bubbles and circles and things in there. So when we're going through this, when I was doing it, I was just interviewing a lot of different people. So there's probably 14 or 15 people that I'll either talk to on Twitter or I'll actually email and be like, hey, what do you think about this scenario? I don't like anything that's less than a probabilistic, sort of a probability of what things might be. That's why you saw me put up 3 scenarios there. I do estimates based on circle size, just on my general feeling of what the group's size might be. So a really troublesome one is Ahrar al-Sham. They're almost like a confederation of jihadi sort of guys and Islamists in Syria. So how do you assess them? You know, there are different connections in there. So I put those together, and then I do an estimate with the overlaps of how I think they might communicate. I came up with those estimates in terms of not official statements, because I don't care about the official statements. I care about what those supporters are talking about in the online community, who I'm reaching out to in terms of the different experts. I'll go to like a Greg Johnson or a J.M. Berger or some of them, and I'll ask them their opinion, because I cannot possibly stay on top of all these different groups. Official statements, I think, will stay with Old Guard Al-Qaeda as long as possible, but I look for pushes and pulls in between. And my assessment on Ansar al-Sharia is in like Libya and Tunisia, and how Ansar al-Sharia in Yemen is going is based on those foreign fighter numbers. So if you actually go read this section, which I think is part 3, which came out in March, and there's an actual, this should be updated already. So like Belmokhtar has reaffirmed and should be Al-Murabba team, which is committed to Zawahiri. But this is one that Mary picked out, and there's 6 of these in there. So they're different scenarios. I don't know what the breakdown is, but I'm trying to give you an estimate of how things might emerge. And I think the main issue that you'll see is in the second chart that goes with this, which is the foreign fighter numbers to Iraq that come out of the Sinjar records. Tunisia, Libya, which I talked about earlier, Yemen, Saudi Arabia. That to me is where the fault lines are. And however those two go, maybe they go Al Qaeda and they stick with them. Maybe they go ISIS, or maybe they go off on their own. I don't know. But that's where the estimate comes from.
Okay, thank you. I think the two of you can talk about this ad nauseum, but I'd actually like to open
Probably.
up questions to the audience to give them a chance. So we'll have 2 staff members walking around with microphones. Please state your name, your affiliation, and please ask a question. Don't ask it as a statement, please. So this man right in front, please.
Thank you very much for the discussion. My name is Bill Hampton, and I serve with SIL International. I have a question, and perhaps because I'm a Mets fan for my life, maybe reality deludes me.
Pond scum, right?
But it seems like when you have these parallel and not necessarily working together hierarchies, it's a scarier thing than just having one to deal with. And I have another quick question, too, and that is, what's going on in Eastern Europe? Is that going to change the equation with what's going on in the world with the terrorist groups? Will that be another opportunity for them then to open a new front?
Great, thanks. So Clint, why don't you start with the question? And
Yeah, so let's go back. Let's actually talk about Eastern Europe first, because we didn't get to the counterterrorism sort of discussion. Wonderful opportunity right now for us to do a little art of war in the information space. The real far enemy right now for Al-Qaeda, Old Guard Al-Qaeda, ISIS is Russia and Iran. Man, they're sticking it to us in the information space right now. Why don't we give a little love back to them, right? So what if instead of trying to just directly counter Old Guard Al-Qaeda, which I think in a lot of ways, as Mary pointed out, is not paying attention to us. They're fighting a bunch of insurgencies all around the world. They're trying to get involved in them. Why don't we shift that? Okay, guys, you know, Iran is really the one supporting the Assad regime and battling you in Syria. 2, you know, Russia, they are really the ones, you know, behind keeping the Assad regime in play. I think there's a lot of opportunities in that information space. The Caucasus Emirate, too, is a real big player in Syria right now. So it's really interesting, like that you can definitely see there's like legions of guys from the Caucasus that are fighting together in Syria. So I gotta think like that will move back out, and I would not be shocked at all if some sort of like huge battle against the Russians or whatever gets tangled up there in that Caucasus region, you know, moving forward. What was your first one again? Just so I can make sure I clearly answer.
It seems to me that when you have these hierarchies that are no longer
Yeah.
it's more of a scary thing than having them all
Yeah, totally agree. So in the fourth part of this, I talk about the two most dangerous scenarios. So I'm a big fan of the competition model. I've been pushing that since 2012. If jihadi groups want to compete with each other, then let's shape the conditions, since we really can't force them to do that, but can we shape the conditions to keep them competing with each other? That works great until they start pursuing external attacks in Europe and the US against each other, trying to one up. What keeps that going is constant resources. So to dry that up, and part of my counterterrorism part, which is part 5 we didn't get to, is the number one thing I think we really got to focus on in terms of counterterrorism strategy is quashing terrorist financiers into Syria right now, or shaping what that is. If ISIS can sustain resources and Al-Qaeda Al-Qaeda continues to sustain resources, they're going to mobilize those resources in a way where they're going to pursue external operations against the U.S. It's in both of their incentives, if they want to be top dog, to sort of display that. So I absolutely agree. The one thing I see about this most dangerous scenario, though, is out of control violence like that tends to erode popular support. And I think that's what you see with ISIS right now. They're kind of going into bumbling plots a little bit, and they're rushing it. I kind of get that sense, like they're really trying to hurry up and do this. And so they're getting caught or nabbed. And I think they'll also hit targets where it starts to alienate the population. So I do think it's a concern, but I think the Europeans should be a lot more worried than us. I think we have a lot to worry about, especially with foreign fighters coming back, but we've gotten a lot better at it in 12 years. It's a testament to here, the counterterrorism community, but the Europeans have got a big problem on their hands. Even, Thomas Heghammer will say somewhere between 3 and 10% of foreign fighters you should suspect are going to go back home and still participate in some sort of violence. If we got 10,000 fighters, that are there right now, 5,000 of them survive the battlefield, I mean, we're still looking at a really significant number, depending on whatever, doesn't matter what team they're on. Yeah, I think you're right.
Mary, do you have something to add?
No, I just found myself nodding my head in agreement. It really depends on where the competition goes. And right now, it looks as if it's pretty evenly divided between fighting each other and attempting to do things elsewhere. But the big thing about ISIS right now is that they seem to be, at least, incapable of carrying out major attacks inside Syria much. In other words, you hear a lot about attacks carried out by them in Iraq, but hardly anything carried out against the regime by ISIS. So when it comes to the competition there, it looks, at least, just looking at it from the outside, that Nusra Front is winning that competition. But when it comes to the split, whether there's more or less violence, depending on whether they splinter or not, actually, I think that just affects your response to it and what you do in order to counter it. You're going to get a ton of violence either way from these guys, unfortunately.
Thank you. The gentleman at the back table.
Stanley Kober, how do these foreign fighters get into and out of Syria? Also the materiel. And from what I'm reading, it's Turkey. They're going through Turkey. Turkey is a NATO member. So how are they transiting Turkey so easily? Could you discuss that?
Thank you. Mary, do you want to start?
I think actually Clint's the expert here.
Kayak.com. Not joking. This is basically it. I mean, they literally just go buy plane tickets. They make their way down to the border. They can link up some connections. The one way they can do it, there's kind of different groups. So you could be a foreign fighter from North Africa or the Middle East, and you're more likely to have your own logistical person, or one of these affiliates like Ansar al-Sharia in Libya. They can actually pipeline you into a certain group. The other way is you just make your way into Turkey. You literally ping some people on social media and be like, hey, how do I get from, they kind of crowdsource their way down there. They get to the border, they link up and like, hey, I want to go in and be a fighter, and they start making their way down there. It's remarkably unsexy. The way we sort of think about it in our minds, I think a lot of times is like the Bourne Identity kind of movies, and it's like really complicated. And then you read their stories and you're like, oh, they just bought a plane ticket and went there. It's really fascinating that it's not cooler, to look at. But yeah, I would say too, there's a difference between Nusra and ISIS. Nusra tends to screen or try to pipeline their guys. They're smarter about it. Whereas ISIS will kind of just take anybody that shows up kind of as like a volunteer.
I think you misunderstand my question a little point. Why aren't the Turkish authorities picking these guys up?
I can't
Especially
speak to that.
if they're out.
All right. I think that we'll move on, but I think Turkey is a little bit overwhelmed with the actual flow of foreign fighters into Syria. We've had U.S. officials talk about the fact that it's the most we've ever seen. It's scores above what we saw going into Iraq. So, gentleman right here.
Hi, my name is Luke Phillips. I'm an undergrad at the University of Southern California, and me and my comrades are actually in a class with Dr. Wayne Glass right now studying nuclear nonproliferation. So that being the subject of our class, I would like to ask our experts, with this divide between the two major camps of jihadist terrorism nowadays, what are the prospects for nuclear terrorism against the United States? What should we be looking for? Because it seems to me if we have two competing blocks of jihadists, there would be less of a nuclear threat directed towards us, and maybe more of a reason to look towards nuclear terrorism in the Middle East itself. But I'd just like to know what you guys think about
Thank
that.
you. Let me just twist that a little bit and ask actually what the threat from chemical weapons would be, especially in Syria.
Yeah, I obviously that's everybody's nightmare, right? A nuclear terrorist attack. But I don't have any basis for making that sort of assessment. I'm sorry about that. It's something obviously we all worry about, but I just don't have any way of assessing it. But when it comes to chemical weapons, we do, because when it was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, they actually did use chemical weapons. They used chlorine bombs, not against the Americans by and large, by the way, but against ordinary Muslims. So, and scores of people were seriously injured, probably for life, and a few people were actually killed in those attacks. So that to me suggests that ISIS, the current incarnation, would be far more likely to use chemical weapons than any of the other groups engaged. And I'm very worried about that coming from ISIS, actually.
Think you have anything?
Yeah, I think ISIS would do it. The only thing that kind of plays to our favor in the really bad scenario is the best people for executing those sorts of things are probably in Yemen. So AQAP really seems to be the group that can do those external operations and really plan things out, do them smartly. I mean, they made underwear bombs and printer card. I mean, they seem to really have it down, like they can think through, like, and really plot out. So, I mean, the only thing that's really to our advantage is that, the stockpiles are in Syria, the best planners and operators are in Yemen. But, if those things collide, then could they put something together like that? Even then, I think the range is limited. If they're going to hit a U.S. target, it's got to be in the region, to do it. The one thing is they're competing with each other so much, and even though there's a lot more violence coming out, they're in a hurry, I think, especially on the ISIS side.
Great. And then the gentleman in the middle of the room.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an Intel analyst. Quran says there shall be no compulsion in religion, and yet you will never hear those words coming out of an American Foreign Service officer. So I want to ask about counterterrorism strategy. Why are we engaging on our turf instead of on their turf? Why aren't we demarching masjid, the mosques, instead of, or in addition to foreign ministries? Why isn't there a group of Quranic scholars at the State Department, sifting through the Quran to come out with appropriate ammunition that can turn down the fields of harvest from where these fighters are coming?
Yeah, so that's obviously a very touchy subject, and one that U.S. officials have been very, very reluctant to engage on. I mean, this would be sort of like, okay, so this is one of the analogies I have in my head for what's going on. Bin Laden saw himself as a mujaddid, that is somebody who was going to renew the religion, right? And he also saw himself as a revivalist, in other words, of the religion, and in addition to being a great leader of jihad. And his vision was that he, alone, amongst all of humanity, understood the true version of Islam, and he was going to impose that version of Islam on people whether they wanted it or not. And we've seen what that looks like in places like Iraq and in Anbar province, for instance, or in northern Mali, or in Somalia, where it's been rejected. But in any case, his vision of going back to the original Islam, and he was making this up as he went along, in some ways reminds one of the Reformation in Europe. So if bin Laden is sort of like, and please, if there are any Lutherans in the room, do not take this amiss, okay? If bin Laden is sort of Calvin or Luther, what role do we play? Well, we get to be the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. right? That's who we are. We're the people who've had a sort of conflictual relationship with this part of the world, and people who are not trusted and looked at a little bit askance, right? And we're trying to make an argument to the Pope that we can solve their Luther problem. It doesn't compute. There's just so little space for us to be doing that as outsiders coming in. So to me, the biggest thing that we can do, and I hope we have been doing it, is encouraging ordinary Muslims and ulema in the Muslim majority world to stand up to these guys and to say what they think and feel. And here's the thing, it's been happening. It's just never repeated in our media. Our media ignores, in fact, all sorts of things. Let me give you a great example. Benghazi attack, everybody here knows about it, right? I mean, that was a huge deal, right? Does everybody know that immediately afterward there was a 100,000 person march through the streets of Benghazi condemning it by the ordinary people of Benghazi? You know, by and large, that was off the radar as far as our media goes. Hardly anybody talked about it even. And I think that that's one of our biggest problems. The only thing we can control is, and hopefully, getting our media to pay more attention to these sorts of things out in the Muslim majority world, rather than focusing on the negative side and on those people who are carrying out terrible attacks.
I agree with what Mary said. I mean, we're just terrible at it. I mean, on the ideological stuff, we try and get involved in it. I've never seen it go very well. We can't coordinate. We're a pluralist society. We got too many opinions. We don't understand it. We're reading it from afar, you know, in translation. We don't have enough experts. We don't have credible voices. Yeah, I agree with her. I do think there's been some success in using other, you know, ideological authorities to counter from that region, you know, or helping them or embracing them. But for us to do it, I don't think we do it very well.
And unfortunately, this has to be the last question. The woman at the front table.
Kayla Foster from the University of Southern California. You mentioned that since Osama bin Laden was killed, the fragmentation of the jihadist world has escalated, and that you mentioned we can't really tell which scenario is going to play out when, but my question is, because the fragmentation has escalated, how do we respond, and is that response going to be less and less viable as that fragmentation escalates?
Watch everything, listen to what they say, and act very rarely, but whatever you choose to do, be very decisive about. So in 2006, we used to run what was like the National Implementation Model for NIMS, whatever, for counterterrorism, and we did hundreds of tasks very poorly and lightly across an enormous bureaucracy. And it was a disaster. I mean, I remember going to meetings, and it would be like the Department of Education. Everybody who wanted to fund something would float an Al-Qaeda dude. And we used to joke, like, if we could just capture an Al-Qaeda guy and smuggle him across the Mexican border, we could fight drugs. I mean, that's how, like, convoluted our strategy was. We were trying to do everything and solve all the world's problems. And in my opinion, with this decentralization, we need to do one thing, which is fight hard for our intelligence capabilities right now while they're under attack, because Mr. Snowden who has failed to prove that there's been this gross negligence in surveilling Americans, has also coughed up to all of our adversaries, to include the nation state of Russia, in which he hides, and a lot of these Al-Qaeda groups who've picked up now on how dominant we were in the intelligence space. With this decentralization and fracturing and infighting, and so many scenarios, I did 3, you could probably do 12. If we're gonna figure out which way it's gonna go, we better have our intelligence capabilities at a peak right now to know what's going on overseas. The other thing is be very nimble in terms of what we pick and be prepared for the repercussions of each. So I'll give you one key decisive point. Let's say we are doing drones and we do decapitation and we get Wuheshi, who I think is the most important person in Old Guard Al-Qaeda, by the way, not Zawahiri. Let's say we get Wuheshi and Yemen. What is the chain of events that will unfold from that? We would expect there would be infighting and twisting one way, but then we could also look externally and see attacks in a lot of different directions, because there are a lot of young folks going off on their own. So to do that, we got to have capabilities. 2, we need to plan for the most dangerous scenarios. I hope administration is doing that right now. What are we going to do if they hit Israel? 2, what are we going to do if we get the scenario? He was talking about this dangerous scenario where these groups are just lashing out in a lot of different directions. And then, 3, not overreact and overextend. Really be focused, pick a few tasks, do them really well, see what shakes out from them, and assess. The one thing I do like that's going on right now is the disposition matrix discussion that came out, and people thought that was the drone targeting list. They were confused about it, but I think that was the smart folks in the counterterrorism community. Forget all the politics. I don't care about that. I work too hard to be a politician. On the counterterrorism side, I think there are some really smart folks in the government, the intel agency, FBI, that have been doing this now for 12 years, and they've sort of figured out, let's come up with the disposition matrix, and how do we mitigate this risk? I think we got to support that instead of constantly tearing that down. And enabling those people with good intelligence coverage, I think it's going to be critical moving forward.
And Mary, if you want to respond to the question and then give a kind of a concluding statement, we'll give Clint the last word.
Right. So first of all, I actually think it's far more ambiguous whether there's this splintering going on or not, as you can tell from my slide deck. And it's really unclear which side is going to win out. But what you can see is that the violence has spiraled out of control. And that violence needs more than we've been doing in recent years. So I have three prescriptions. I would say first and foremost, we need to stop the de-escalation that's going on in our fight. I mean, this is the first time in our 26-year struggle with Al-Qaeda that we are de-escalating what we're doing. So since 2011, and I don't think it's any coincidence that the violence has spiraled out of control since 2011, we have de-escalated what we're doing. We withdrew from Iraq. We're withdrawing from Afghanistan. We're cutting a lot of capabilities. We're doing all sorts of things to draw this fight down and try to pretend it's still 1995. I don't think we can pretend it's 1995. It's not going to ever be 1995 again. The second thing that we should be doing is we should be paying attention to this and not ignoring what's happening in the rest of the world. So we've been very focused on ourselves, and I'm not saying we should ignore, our own security, and pretend that we don't have there's not a threat against us as well. But we cannot pretend as well that there's violence out here has no meaning. I mean, look, even if you want to say these have nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, the fact that you've gone from this to this says we have to be doing more, that we cannot simply withdraw into our own country and pretend all is well with the world, right? And the final thing is we can't depend solely on attrition. Attrition works for small terrorist groups. You kill off the small group, they don't replace themselves, problem solved, right? It does not work at all for insurgencies. And in fact, it can exacerbate them. It can use as a point of recruitment for them, right? So attrition alone is not the solution, and we really need to find another solution. By the way, that's one of the things that AEI and I are working on, and have been working on for quite a while. We're hoping to find an answer to that.
And Clint, concluding thoughts.
Okay. Concluding thoughts? We got bigger fish to fry than terrorism right now, to be honest with you. We got Russia, Iran, and the climate change is something I'm really concerned about. If climate change is real, I don't know if it is or not. This is all really kind of silly, in the big picture. I mean, we're talking about collapse in 20, 30 years and things like that. The second thing I would tell you is stop listening to Al-Qaeda experts. There are too many things going on. You really got to find people who are experts in regions, and I rely on them. I do. Jan Berger, Aaron Zellen, Andrew Lebovich, all these great folks that are out there, Greg Johnson, Will McCants, I talk to all of them, and I can't stay on top of all of this. So if you really want to understand Boko Haram and all this, you better have language skills, okay? I grew up in the Cold War. I wasn't very smart, so I learned Spanish. It's kind of useless now. I can't stay on top of any of this. 2, you better have people that have been on the ground in those countries and have really learned things and understand the cultural and religious and ideological dynamics. 3, you got to work them together in interdisciplinary teams. So there's been some great stuff done in computing. There's been some really fantastic stuff even in mathematical modeling of attacks. You really got to have that. And who has that? We got to trust in our government. They really do have it. I mean, they're not all great, but they're a lot better than they were 12 years ago, which brings me to, we're talking about de-escalation. I was in the Army in 1995. Never once did I see parallel raids in 2 places in Africa on the same day. Baraway, Somalia, Tripoli, Libya. We did 2 raids on the same day. Got one, didn't get the other guy, but withdrew with no casualties. Fire it up. We could not do this 12 years ago. We were on our heels in counterterrorism. That is a testament to our military and intel folks that have been out there working. And so I am not about de-escalation. I'm about being surgical. I'm about being nimble and not overreaching. If you really want to bring all these jihadi groups together, just do a foreign intervention. We'll get right back where we were 6-7 years ago. So it goes to your point that you had brought up about being very nimble and focused. Let's really think through what we're doing, but let's not be silly and think that we're not going to have another attack from one of these groups. It's going to happen. Let's do our best to sort of mitigate it. Let's empower those people that we've really brought on the past 10 to 12 years. I mean, to think that we do a raid in Somalia and Libya at the same time, it took like a half hour. Does anybody watch that video of them nabbing that old Al-Qaeda guy out of Libya in the middle of the streets of Tripoli? 30 seconds? Holy cow, we could not do this. So we've really built some great capability. Let's keep empowering them and not tear them down with our politics and our, sort of debates here in the States.
Thank you both. Please join me in thanking our panelists today and FCRI who also helped us out today.
Yeah, it's good.
I think they'll be sticking around afterwards if you want to come up and ask them questions. I know I certainly have some follow-up, but it'll probably be on email. Thank you again.